Hi students, this is your instructor Megan, and in this video I'm going to talk about logo design for blogs. So first, I want to tell you about a website header. Websites can be broken up into some basic pieces. Pretty much every website has the following basic pieces: a header, a body, a sidebar, and a footer. And you'll learn about that in more detail when we talk about information architecture, but I want to mention it today because we're talking about logos for blogs, and I want you to sort of start thinking now about what that is and how it's going to fit on your website. So a website header is the top part of the website. A website header is always at the top, almost always spans all the way from left to right, although sometimes it's placed vertically along the left hand side of the website. And the website header includes the logo, navigation, which you may know better as menu, and any kind of advertising or search bars or really anything above the main content of the site. So in this example of the Ball State website, you'll see that the header has a logo that says Ball State University Education Redefined, and that's a picture. And then underneath that, it has the main navigation. Now, the Ball State University website has some secondary navigation, so a second menu bar up across the top. I know that the one across the top is secondary because it's smaller and it's kind of grayed out a little bit, and so it's not meant to be as important as the main navigation, which is highlighted in red and somewhat larger. And then we have a search bar up in that website header as well. And just as another example, website headers can look a little bit different. They're not always arranged in the same way. The Children's Museum of Indianapolis website header, for example, has a logo on the left in the corner, and then the navigation sort of on the same line as the logo over on the right, and a search bar above that. And it only has one navigation bar, whereas the Ball State website has a primary and a secondary. Now, the search is almost always in the upper right-hand corner of a website, and that's just because that's where people expect them to be. In early web designs, the search bar was often placed in the upper right-hand corner, and so now people pretty much always expect it to be there, especially since you're starting to have browsers now with search bars in the upper right-hand corner. So that's where the search bar goes. So search bars almost always in the website header. The logo's always in the header. The navigation's always in the header. And this header is pretty simple: logo, navigation, search. Now, there's two ways of presenting a blog. When you're working with content strategy and you're looking at putting a lot of content on the web to market or message your brand, there's two ways to do it. The first is internal, and that's to create the blog as part of the client's main website. So in this case, the blog header is the same as the site header because you're just clicking a button that says blog to see blog entries. You're never actually leaving the site. The second way of presenting a blog is an external blog, and this is when the blog is a different website altogether. So in this case, the blog header usually includes the brand logo, but it's usually slightly different from the website header. And when you visit the blog, you're going to a completely different site with totally different content. So let's look at some examples. The Make-A-Wish website has a series of blogs on it, and they're internal. This is the site over on the left. When you click the About Us button, there's a drop down. You can choose, actually I don't think there's a drop down. I think you click it and then there's another bar and you can choose blog, and you end up on this page over to the right. So you never actually leave the site. You click About Us and then blogs, and you end up over here on the right, and you can see that the navigation and the header for Make-A-Wish on the right is the same as it is on the left. You still have that navigation, wishes, About Us, local chapters, and then the logo. So the top of the website, the header, doesn't actually change. It stays the same because you're on the same site. So in an internal blog, the blog doesn't get its own header. It just takes on the header of the site it's hosted on. Now, the second technique, an external blog, is when the blog is totally a different site. So the Indianapolis Museum of Art uses this technique. This is their site on the left that you go to if you just Google Indianapolis Museum of Art. This is their blog over on the right, and it's a completely different site. When you click the link on the left to go to the blog, it takes you to a new site over on the right. You can see it looks much different. So the blog header on the external site is related to the one on the left, but it's not exactly the same because you are leaving the site and going to a different blog. So either way, whether your blog is its own site, an external site, or whether it's housed on your main website, you need a logo, and the logo will either be the logo for the entire website, or you'll have a very specific logo just for your blog. So either way, you have to design some kind of website header. And in this class, you're going to create an external blog, which means you're going to create a different website altogether. And I just want to explain this because I do get some questions about why are we doing it this way. The difficulty with everyone working with their own client, well, let me start with the benefit. The benefit of everyone working with their own client is that you have the option to work with a real client and create real work, which you can use in your resume and portfolio. You also get the option to choose a client that interests you, that you could stand to work with for 16 weeks. The downside is that everyone has a client that's a little bit different, and some of your clients will have a need for a very large website, a website with 20, 30, 40 pages. Some of your clients are smaller and could make do with just 2 or 3 pages. And so if you had to spend a lot of time making your entire client site, it just kind of depends on your client how much of an undertaking that would be. And I don't want you to lose focus of the content as you work on these sites. So in order for you to focus on content and not have to worry about how many pages you need to make, you're going to be creating an external site. Now, if you are interested in web design or using different software tools to make websites, I would highly suggest that you sign up for ICOM 201, Web Design and Usability. It's a course in the digital media minor that is all about web design and testing websites. So if you are looking forward to creating a website sort of from scratch, I would suggest looking into that class. But we're not going to do that in this class. You're going to create an external blog and you're going to focus on publishing content to it. You're going to do some design on that site. You're going to put the WordPress site, we're going to put the blog together in WordPress, but I want you to create an external site so that you can focus on the content. So in this case, you're going to create a blog header that may include the brand logo, but it's not going to just be the brand logo. So you're going to actually have to design some kind of header. Let's talk about some design considerations for logos. Knowing that you'll need to design some kind of header, I thought it would be helpful to first talk about logos in general and then talk about the specifics of blog header logos. So let's talk about logos first, and then we'll move on to some additional design considerations for blog logos. And I'm just going to go through these in order, which means we're going to start by looking at logo considerations in general, and this is both for blogs and for print, really any logo for any client. The best logos are based on a concept. This is one of the sort of starting points for any logo, is to come up with an abstract idea or general notion of what the logo is going to represent or show or be. You need some kind of concept. A logo with no concept is less likely to be effective. And to show what I mean by concept, let's look at an example. And we're going to look at Tangerine. Tangerine is a bank company that provides savings accounts, mutual funds, other bank services that may not sound very exciting. Their slogan is forward banking, and so their logo concept is forward. And if you look at their logo, I think it's probably pretty obvious where forward plays into this. You have this orange arrow pointing at the end of the logo, so you read the word tangerine and then an arrow sort of points you forward. So the arrow represents forward, which goes along with the slogan forward banking. Let's look at another example. We're going to look at the logo for a company called Resonance. They make wireless charging stations, which are those little plastic pads that you can just set your electronic devices on and they'll charge wirelessly. They consider themselves the next generation wireless charging standard, and their logo concept is wireless power. Let's take a look at their logo, and I think it's pretty clear right away the idea of power. Even if this logo didn't say Alliance for Wireless Power underneath it, when you saw the lightning bolt, you would probably think of electricity or power. Indianapolis Power and Light in Indianapolis uses a similar lightning bolt in their logo design. And So the lightning bolt indicates power, and then the way the lightning bolt is connecting the top and bottom of the Z indicates this sort of wireless connection. It's the power that's connecting the top to the bottom, so it gives that idea of wireless power. The next consideration that you want to have in mind when you're designing a logo is visual connotation and messaging. The best logos feature the same visual connotation and messaging as the brand or content strategy suggests. So let's look at one example that I think you've seen before. Vera Bradley. Vera Bradley makes handbags, luggage, little accessories for handbags and luggage, little keychains and things. The logo concept is sort of this handcrafting process behind the scenes. This is the concept for their blog logo. You see their actual logo, their brand logo down at the bottom, which is the name Vera Bradley. And of course, it's written in not just handwriting, but what we assume to be Vera Bradley's actual signature, which gives us the sense that Vera Bradley is a real person, that these bags are designed by a woman for women in a very handcrafted and loving manner. And so their brand personality and connotation is sort of this fun, casual bags and accessories designed by women and for women. So if we look at their logo header on their blog, you'll see that starts to come through. You have the connotation and message carry over from their logo into their blog header. And so you'll see they actually do have the logo over on the right so that we know immediately this blog is part of the Vera Bradley family. We have the logo is placed on this sort of, you can buy these at the fabric store. They're like little labels that you can put your name on that you can sew into your handmade clothes. They look like little label tags for clothes, and it's pinned and it's stitched, and that gives the sense that this is handcrafted by a person, which again, we kind of assume Vera Bradley is running the show here, right? And so this gives it a very personable feel. We have the print with the bright colors at the top, which is instantly recognizable as a Vera Bradley print. It's colorful, fun, stylish, distinctive. We have this typography on the left. Inside stitch is in this square serif, which is a type race in which the serifs on the letters, the little pieces that stick off, like on the tips of the S and the T, are rectangular in form. And this is a typeface that is really trendy right now. It's kind of fun and playful. It actually comes from the early 1900s and was used in a lot of advertising back then. And then we have this texture behind the header, which is canvas, a very clean, off-white colored canvas, which gives us this sort of sense of casualness and also of, you know, being made with care. In fact, this entire blog header looks like someone is setting down materials they're about to use in a design. You have a sketch of the flower, you have this paper across the top that looks like maybe it could be dress patterns or perhaps handbag patterns. You have a little swatch of fabric over on the right. You have the sewing pin. So this blog header not only gives the message and the connotation that Vera Bradley wants, which is stylish, fun, casual, handcrafted, but also has a concept, which is behind the scenes of a bag maker, which is where the name Inside Stitch comes from. Inside Stitch you would expect to sort of be behind the scenes. So the concept here is strong as well. The next consideration for designing a logo is design principles. Balance, harmony, contrast, rhythm, proportion, focus, and unity. You learned these in 103, but I'm going to review them because I'm sure it's probably been a while for some of you guys. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I will talk a little bit about each one. Balance. The design principle of balance considers how much visual weight we have on both sides of a design. And a lot of people think balance is just you know, if something is symmetrical, if you can fold it in half and everything on the left side of the paper, of the fold in the paper, matches up with everything on the right. But symmetrical balance is only one type of balance. Balance just means that there's equal visual weight on both sides. They don't have to be in the same place. And when I say equal visual weight, or when I say visual weight, what I mean is that what I'm referring to are things that draw the eye. Bright colors draw the eye. Large shapes draw the eye. Interesting textures draw the eye. So in a design, anytime you have visual weight spread out, you have balance. So if we go back to Vera Bradley, if you draw a line down the center, let's look at where all the visual weight is. There's some visual weight here with the words inside stitch and some visual weight with these papers. Then we have some weight with this sew in label, this swatch, and this flower. If we draw a line down the center, there's about as much visual weight on the left as there is on the right. Harmony refers to elements working together. And when I say elements on this slide, I'm talking about those design elements from last week. Color, shape, size, texture, type. When those elements work together, when they have something in common, that's harmony. When design elements have variety, when they stand out against each other, that's contrast. And the interesting thing about web design and design in general is you do want harmony and contrast. These are not mutually exclusive. You want to have a certain amount of harmony and a little bit of contrast to draw attention to certain elements. So in this design, we have harmony because we have a lot of the same colors and shapes being used over and over again. We have a lot of brown, pink, and orange. So pink and orange and purple are here. They're repeated in this pattern here. The only other colors are neutral. The color of the sew-in label is the same color as the inside stitch lettering. You have this texture that is harmonious. You have a canvas texture here and then a sort of bag texture, you know, I'm not quite sure what to call it, like a quilted texture here, that are both fabric textures. Even the sew-in label has a fabric texture to it. So we have also these sort of rectangle shapes. We have the rectangle of the sew-in, we have the rectangle of the swatch, we have the rectangle of the edge of the letters and the rectangles in the little stitches here, but you also have some contrast. Some of these colors are brighter than others, so this flower is the brightest thing. It contrasts a lot with the background. These are really bright colors. The background is a very neutral color, so even though we have harmony of shape and color, we also have some contrast as well. Rhythm is a principle describing, the name for a principle describing the eye movement across the design. You want to keep the eye moving. So if we look here, you read inside stitch, your eye kind of jumps up and sees the flower, and then you read Vera Bradley. So there's a very clear reading pattern here. You just go from left to right. That's the rhythm of that page. Proportion, contrast of size is present. You learned a little bit about this last week. You want some things to be much larger than others. You want to have a consistent proportion, some things that are small, some things that are large. Related to proportion is the principle of focus, the idea that something on the page has to be the largest and draw the most attention. And I always say, if everything is big, nothing is big. Something on the design has to stand out and draw my eye to it and create focus. And then finally, unity. Unity is basically the same principle as harmony, except harmony deals with a single design. So a magazine page, a newspaper page. Unity refers to multiple pieces of the same publication or publications within a brand. So a magazine page can have harmony, but if all the magazine pages use the same typeface, the same colors, and the same kind of layout, then that entire magazine would have unity. This is very important on websites as well. People expect all of the pages to look like they're part of the same site. So if you click from one page to the next and the header stays the same and the colors stay the same and the type stays the same, then you've created unity, which is exactly what you need to do. Let's take a quick look at a logo that employs these design principles, and I'm going to look at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which you may know as the host of the Oscars. The logo concept here is just let's showcase the award. You might think of the brand Oscars as elegant, elite, top tier, and sort of show busy. So let's take a look at that logo. And we're looking for the design principles. So balance, harmony, contrast, rhythm, proportion, focus. We're not going to have unity here because unity requires us to have multiple pages, and this is just one. And you can see how the design principles are used. We have balance. If we divide this logo down the center, you'll see there's equal visual weight on the left and right. This is symmetrical. Focus, the gold A is the brightest thing on the page. It's also the largest thing on the page, and so it draws our attention. We have harmony because the same color used in the A is used in the type underneath it. You have rhythm, and I've sort of traced the path of the I. Sort of look at the Oscar and the A and you realize, oh, that's a clever idea. That's the A and the Oscar. And then your eye sort of comes down and you read Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And then we have proportion and contrast. We have a big image of the Oscar and the A, and the type is much smaller compared to it. So we have good proportion here. This is also a good example of how the design elements create connotation. You have gold as the primary color here. The gold mimics the gold of the Oscars. When you think of the Oscars, I'm sure you immediately think of the statue. Again, the shape also sends the message. It's clearly an Oscar shape in there. And then with the type, we have this all cap sort of classic typography. It looks like this could have been the typography of the Academy Awards for the entire time it's existed. It just looks very classic, very sturdy and strong, as if the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences is very credible and, deserving of giving these awards out. So let's talk about some logo principles. Design principles are principles that are applied to any type of design. I sometimes have students ask, when we design things, how are you grading it? Because a lot of people think that aesthetics or design is subjective. Maybe if they choose pink and I don't like pink, they'll get a poor grade. And it's really the design principles that anchors design and anchors my evaluation of your design. The design principles are tried and true principles for design. We're able to study how people view things. We can eye track and see how people look at web pages, how people look at print, how people look at other kinds of designs. And we also can study the brain and how the brain works, which I talked a little bit about last week with affectivity. So because of that, we know that using these design principles results in designs that are aesthetically pleasing and help convey messages. So when I'm looking at your work, I'm looking at, did you employ these design principles? Not, do I like the color that you used? I'm gonna look at the colors and see if the colors create contrast, if they create harmony, if the colors match the messaging that you've discussed. Now, on top of the design principles, which we can use in any kind of design, web design, print design, logo design, I want to talk about some principles that are specific to logos, logo design principles. There's a few that I want to go into in more depth. First is simplicity. Second is memorability. You want to make sure that that logo is pretty easy to remember, so that people recognize it anytime they see it. You want to make sure it's timeless. You don't want to go with a logo that's overly trendy because soon that trend will fade. As an example, for the last few years it's been really trendy to have gradients in logos. This is just a quick Google image search to prove my point. Gradients are this sort of effect where we go from light to dark, or we have a color that fades to another color. Anytime we have this fade, that's a gradient. So gradients have been really popular in logo design for the last few years, but that trend is starting to go away. So you want to avoid creating a logo or a blog header that's overly trendy because you don't want to be changing it next year. You want to create a logo that's versatile, that can be used in different ways, that's appropriate, so make sure the tone is appropriate. You don't want to have a logo for a hospital for example, that's like a little stick figure with gloves dancing around. You know, it doesn't really have the appropriate tone for a hospital. And then just to remind, really drill it in, simple, simple. So let's look at what I mean by simplicity in logos. Logos should be easily recognizable, and so simple is great. And one of the best examples, of course, is the Nike logo. I don't even have to tell you this is Nike. This is extremely recognizable, but it's actually very, very simple. In fact, it is 2 lines with a fill between them. And when translated to the Nike blog, it's so well known that they just shrink it down and stick it on the navigation bar. They don't really need much else to tell you that this is a Nike site. You see that swoosh and you know it's Nike. And let's look at another example. Go Media is a design firm in, I believe, Cleveland, Ohio. And this is the logo for their website on the top, and this is the logo for their blog on the bottom. So they're keeping it simple. Their logo is simple text, and then for the blog, they just combine Go Media into one word, and they add zine at the end in a different color. So it's obvious you're on a different site, but it's also obvious you are still looking at Go Media content. So nice and simple. The logo should be versatile as well. Now, your blog header does not need to be versatile. You're going to create one, put it on your blog, and that's pretty much it. You're not really going to use that blog header anywhere else, and you're not going to change the design of your blog too much, if at all, in the next few years, you know, if you really make it live and use it. But logos themselves should be versatile, and so I want to talk about that a little bit here because I think it's a good thing to know, especially since you may be working with logos in your job in the future. You might not necessarily be making them, but you'll have to put them on things, you know, stick them on newsletters, things like that. So a good logo is versatile. These are logo examples from the United Way Brand Guidelines book, which is available online. And you can see this is their logo on the left, and there's different variations that you can use in different situations. So if you're dealing with only black and white, but you have the potential for grayscale, you could use this version. If you have no potential for grayscale, you could use this. If you just get one color, if you can only, you know, print in blue or red, this is what you can make it look like. And if you need to put it on something black, you can use it in this format. So this logo is pretty versatile. It can be used in different ways. So the next consideration when dealing with logos is making the logo and figuring out what kind of format you want for it. So I want to talk a little bit about vector graphics. You're probably used to dealing with anything that's a picture, whether it's a logo or a picture from your camera or a background on your desktop. You probably are used to dealing with those in Photoshop, and logos work a little bit differently. So I want to talk about vector graphics. So there's 2 ways for computers to remember graphics. You know, when you save a file in Photoshop, or you save a file in Illustrator, or, you know, any visual editing program, there's one of 2 ways that that program can possibly remember, you know, save the data into that file. Photoshop uses what's called raster graphics. And in this type of file, the computer remembers pixels. So when you open a photo from your phone or something on Photoshop and you save it, when you press save, the computer jots down information about how many pixels make up this image, what color they are, and what order they're in. Now, pixels are squares. They're the smallest little dot of color that your screen can possibly show. And we'll look at an example in a couple slides. Raster graphics are always rectangular, and if you're dealing with a JPEG, GIF, PNG, or TIFF, then you are dealing with raster graphics, in which the JPEG, GIF, PNG, or TIFF is remembering pixels. Now, the opposite of that, the other way for a program to save and remember a file is vector graphics. And I always sort of think of vector graphics as being very similar to like 8th grade math class, or perhaps 9th grade math class. Remember in math class, many moons ago, when you had to solve equations, and when you solved them, they gave you points on a grid, and you'd have to draw the little points on a grid and then connect the dots to form shapes. Sometimes it would be a line, sometimes it would be a circle. This is kind of what vector graphics are. Illustrator is a vector program. It deals with vector graphics, and in vector graphics, the computer remembers lines and shapes. So it basically boils all these lines and shapes down into math, just like it's like doing the reverse of what you did in 8th grade math class. And it remembers the attributes of these lines and shapes. So in vector graphics, the program saves the file, and the file has information about how many lines are in the design, what kind of shapes are there, what color the shapes are, how big they are, and these file types, there are several, but you'll probably recognize an EPS and an AI. AI stands for Adobe Illustrator. So let's look at raster very quickly. Logos, again, are not raster graphics, and we have a photo here on the left. If I zoom in, I can actually see the pixels that make up this photo. And a photo has a set number of pixels. That means if you blow a photo up, you're really just making the pixels bigger. Now, you'll learn a little bit more about photo editing later in this class. So there are some techniques to try to blow up a picture and add pixels. It doesn't work that well. So generally, the general rule is if you have a picture, blowing it up, it's not going to work very well. So when you blow up a photo, you lose quality, because most of the time what you're doing is you're just making all those pixels bigger. And so you'll see that this file, this picture, is made up of just all these colored squares. And when you save a raster image, the computer just remembers how many of these pixels or squares there are, what order they're in, and what color they are. And what's interesting about this is you can get lifelike images with pixels. If you look at the photo on the left, you can see that there's a reflection in her glasses. When you zoom in over on the right, it just looks like a bunch of differently colored green squares, but the effect is similar to that gradient effect. You can go from light to dark, so you can show shadows, you can show changes in skin tone, you can show realism with these pixels. Now, here's an example of a vector graphic. This is a logo on the left, and I just opened it in Illustrator, and when I zoom in, you'll see on the right, it looks great. There's no squares, it doesn't get fuzzy, it doesn't get weird like the raster graphic, and that's because these are all shapes, and we can shrink or blow up the shapes as much as we want. There's no set number of pixels here like there is in the previous example. So in Illustrator, in vector graphics, such as those used in Illustrator, the computer remembers shapes and their attributes. So you can take a circle that's 5 inches and you can make it 50 inches and it's still going to look like a great circle. And that's what we're seeing here. So when we design logos or headers or anything that we might later need as a different size, we want to work in vector programs. Now here's where it gets a little bit weird. When you design in Illustrator and you create a vector and you want to put it on the web doesn't really deal well with vectors. So what you do is you make the vector in Illustrator and then you export it into a raster. And what this does is it sort of locks in their size. You have the original vector file and then you export, and that creates a second file that converts your nice shapes into pixels, into those squares. And that locks that exported file into that size and shape forever. The benefit of doing this is that you can use the same vector file over and over. So if I have this logo in Illustrator and it's 5 inches, I can export it as a 5-inch logo that's ready for the web. I export it to a raster. But then I get a phone call and someone at the company wants this logo to be 50 feet wide for a billboard. I go into Illustrator and I just type in, go from 5 inches to 50 feet, it'll blow it up, and then I can export that into a raster and send it to them. Now the raster is going to be a lot bigger because it's going to have way more pixels, but I can use this Illustrator file over and over and over again to make different sizes and different versions of rasters. So that's the benefit of starting with vector. Now, raster cannot really be converted to vector. All you can do is try to trace it. I get this question sometimes in class, and I'll have a student or two who's seen Illustrator, and they'll say, well, doesn't Illustrator have a button that traces it for you? And the answer is yes, but it's terrible. So when you have something that's raster and you put it in Illustrator and you try to convert it to a vector, it's not going to come out very good. You really can't do raster to vector without tracing it in Illustrator. And the thing about Illustrator is because it doesn't have pixels like we have here, you can't really get the same realism. Shapes and lines are never really going to be able to have the shadow effect from raster if they're vector, because vector doesn't have squares that it can sort of go from light to dark. So here, for example, the edge of her glasses, it's light green and it goes to dark green in the center. There's no opportunity for that here with our vector, and so we're never going to get that realism that we get in raster. Let's talk about some additional considerations that you'll need to think about as you create a blog header. Everything we've just talked about is applicable to logos in general, but you're creating not just a logo, but a header for your blog that may include your logo, but it's going to be somewhat different in nature, just like Inside Stitch on the Vera Bradley site includes the logo, but it's a whole different concept. So due to the standard web design principles, the idea that the header always goes at the top, website headers are very horizontal in nature. They're almost always from left to right in a very horizontal fashion. Not all logos are horizontal, so what do you do if you have a logo that's not horizontal and you have to put it on your website? Logos can be adapted to the web. You just reconfigure them, and I'll show you an example in a minute. And then blog headers can include the logo in a horizontal format. So you can create a blog header with a logo that's kind of smaller and vertical. It'll just be one part of it. So let's look at the Aquarium of the Pacific. This is their logo on the right. It's very square. It's a little bit vertical seeming. And this is what they've done on their website. Because the header of a website is generally very horizontal, they have changed the look of it. They've taken what's called the logo mark, the wavy C with the bird underneath it, and put it to the left. And then they've taken the word mark, which is the word part of a logo, Aquarium of the Pacific, and they've typed it out horizontally. And then what I think is really neat is, of course, they have the water texture, which gives the connotation of aquariums. And they have this very faint handwritten Aquarium of the Pacific behind the logo, the word mark, Aquarium of the Pacific. So you can just barely see it, but it's a really cool effect. It gives this a lot of visual interest, and what I think is interesting, it gives it visual depth. You're stacking, so you have water, and then on top of that, the handwritten part, and then on top of that, the word mark and the logo mark, and so you have this layering effect that creates depth. Just like when you get dressed in the morning, you might wear a tank top or a long sleeve shirt that's not the main part of your outfit. You know, you put on a long sleeve shirt and then you put another sweater over it so that you can have the edges of your cuff peek out, or maybe you can have the collar peek out from the top. You do that because it creates depth, which has a certain air of sophistication and visual interest, and they've done the same thing here. Two more considerations for blog headers specifically. The first is to be sort of horizontal in shape, and the second is to match the brand standards. The website header obviously should match the brand standards, so I'll just show you a couple examples. This is the Groupon site on the top, and then the blog on the bottom. Very, very similar. Lots of things in common. They both use the logo, they both use the same colors, they have this sort of thin type on all of the sites. Riley Hospital for Children, here's their website header on the top, and here's their blog header at the bottom, and you can see they've named their blog header Riley Connections, which is very common and something you may choose to do in your blog header. And then they've included the logo. I've changed my little bubbles to blue so they don't get confused with the red on these sites. So again, you have all caps, which came from the original website. You have the blue from the original website. You have the logo. You have that red line across the top, just like the original website has. And then you have this sort of shadow texture, which comes again from here. Underneath Riley Connections, you have a shadow. Underneath this header, you have shadows as well. So that's a texture element that they're carrying over. Again, I always point this out. I'm using IU examples. You go to Ball State. I work at Ball State. I love Ball State, but in this example, they have a really, in their weareiu.com, they have a really good example for this class. So I'm just going to keep going with it. This is their website header across the top, and this is their blog header at the bottom. Again, you can probably immediately spot some similarities. All caps in the type, crimson, very clearly used in both of these. You have lots of boxy shapes on the top. Everything is boxes. On We Are IU, everything is boxes. Even the type has boxes in it. These are the this is a slab serif with these heavy boxes on it. You've got a little bit of handwriting actually on both sites. You have, oops, that's not supposed to be there. You have the flat texture from the website. These both use what's called flat design. All the elements are a solid color. There's no gradients, there's no glossy looking elements, there's no canvas texture. Everything is just a solid color. And that's carried over from the website to the blog header. And last but not least, an example from Coca-Cola. You can sort of make your own determination of how they've carried these things over. What I think is interesting about this is the texture on the blog header is the texture from their can, from their soda can. Now the last consideration when designing blog headers is very simple, and it's just that you want to save as a ping for the web. And I'll go over this again when I introduce your homework, but .png or ping is the only web-friendly file type that gives you a clear background if you need one. This is the Wikimedia Commons logo. On the left is a ping, on the right is a JPEG. A JPEG has a white background. If you don't give it a background, it automatically has a white background. So if you're going to put this on a website and you want it to be in the header, it would be kind of awkward to use the JPEG because people might think the white background is part of the logo. You can see it's blocking out the gradient of the slide behind it. So when you create blog headers, think about, do you want this weird white area, or maybe you're going to pick a color and make it a color, or do you want it to just be clear so you can see the website behind it? If so, then you want a ping. That's everything that I wanted to cover. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to send them to me, and I will look forward to seeing your blog headers at the end of the week.